Basic psychology. Neurons and synaptic transmission. The structure and function of neurons. The three types of neurons are sensory neurons, relay neurons, and motor neurons.
Interesting. What are the functions of these different types of neurons?
Sensory neurons transmit information from sensory receptors, like in the eyes, ears, and skin, to the spinal cord and brain. Relay neurons are located in the brain and spinal cord, and they allow the sensory and motor neurons to communicate.
And what about the motor neurons?
Motor neurons are located in the central nervous system and project their axons to control muscle contractions. When they fire, the muscles they're connected to contract, with the strength of the contraction depending on the rate of firing.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I didn't realize the complexity of the nervous system.
Yes, it's quite remarkable. Each neuron consists of a cell body, dendrites, and an axon, which all work together to transmit information throughout the body.
And what about the myelin sheath? I've heard that plays an important role.
Absolutely. The myelin sheath is an insulating layer that forms around the axon, allowing nerve impulses to transmit more rapidly. If the myelin sheath becomes damaged, it can slow down the transmission of these impulses. The process of synaptic transmission. Between neurons, there's a gap called the synapse that is bridged using neurotransmitters.
Neurotransmitters? What are those?
Neurotransmitters are molecules that are released by the axon terminal of one neuron and diffuse across the synapse to the receptors on the next neuron.
I see. And what happens when the neurotransmitters reach the receptors?
The receptors on the postsynaptic neuron recognize and are activated by the specific neurotransmitter, which can then produce either excitatory or inhibitory effects on the neuron.
Wow, that's fascinating. What are some examples of common neurotransmitters?
Some of the most common neurotransmitters are dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, and acetylcholine.
And how long does the synaptic transmission process take?
Synaptic transmission happens very quickly, in a fraction of a second. The effects of the neurotransmitters are terminated by a process called reuptake, where the neurotransmitter is taken back up by the presynaptic neuron. Excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. Excitatory neurotransmitters, like dopamine, noradrenaline, and acetylcholine, make a nerve impulse or action potential more likely to be triggered. This causes the postsynaptic neuron to fire.
I see. And what about inhibitory neurotransmitters?
Inhibitory neurotransmitters, such as GABA and serotonin, make it less likely that a neuron will fire and stop nerve impulses at the postsynaptic neuron.
Wow, so they have opposite effects on the body and mind?
Exactly. Inhibitory neurotransmitters generally have a calming effect, while excitatory neurotransmitters are linked to the opposite effect.
That's really fascinating. How does the body determine whether a cell will fire or not?
The likelihood of a cell firing is determined by adding the excitatory postsynaptic potential, EPSP, and the inhibitory synaptic input, IPSPs. This is known as the summation.
I see. So if excitatory synapses are more active, the cell will fire at a higher rate?
Exactly. And if inhibitory synapses are more active, the cell will either fire at a lower rate or not fire at all.